Well, this is Christopher Perrin. I'm so grateful for those of you taking some time to be with us. Thank you for joining. And you can see Marissa, who's just spoken to you, with Cap in our marketing department, and Nate, who is really the person who is architecting and behind the creation of these volumes. And I'm just going to introduce Nate a bit, and then ask him to say a word about himself. Nate is somebody who uh, I don't know. He can't help being a student, so he's been in. He keeps getting degrees, and he really enjoys literature. He enjoys all things that are humane. He also studied theology. He's um, Poetry is a love of his, and he's also studied teaching. He has a master's of art and teachings from the Templeton Honors College, and has been a teacher. And so it's really for a long time. It's helpful when an editor who's creating curriculum is also somebody who is taught. Um, and it's just, you have to, that's, so he's been bringing pedagogical expertise to this whole project. Um, Nate, what else would you say about yourself, and by way of introducing Humanitas, like who are you and why is Humanitas therefore a kind of fit for a humanist like you, a Christian humanist like you?
It's a great question. Who am I?
Uh,
Yeah, I guess you're very flattering. An architect. Yeah, maybe more of a cobbler. I just see Jonathan Horner is in my hometown here in Raleigh, North Carolina. Hello, Jonathan. Um, yeah, I'm a cobbler. So I have a bunch of various interests and sort of spheres that I've worked in for my background. So I have degrees in history and English, degrees in theology, as you mentioned, and classical education. So Humanitas, when I was kind of looking at um, what I was going to do career wise, Humanitas was so intriguing to me because I've spent 15 years in the classroom. Most of that is at the high school level. I've taught collegiate and graduate courses as well, but most of it has been teaching seventh through 12th grade. And I've been teaching interdisciplinary humanities courses.
mm,
So, what happens when you teach history and literature, philosophy and theology, visual art, music? What happens when you do that all together?
mm,
What happens when you do that in the classroom with freshmen, sophomores, juniors? So, I have spent the last decade and a half teaching these kinds of courses with the actual students coming from the ages and the types of schools. I've been at Christian schools, classical schools. I've taught in some public settings, um, honors programs, the North Carolina Governor's School, Johns Hopkins Center for Talented Youth, things like
mm,
that.
mm.
Um, so when I looked at Humanitas, I went, this is what I have been doing, and it's what I've been trying to do, and getting colleagues interested in it, and getting students to fall in love with all these different things. So it appealed to me in many ways, just because it's what I wish somebody had been able to give me when I was fresh out of undergrad and grad school and starting to teach.
Mhm. Thank you, Nate. Yeah, that's really a good way of thinking about why we're spending so much time trying to create this. Is we do believe that this is something that people, even if they don't know it, want. We certainly would have liked to have had something like this in our past. And would you just describe it? Therefore, like, I'm thinking of the 3 minute kind of nutshell. We're going to unpack it a bit. And by the way, for the sake of you participants, we are going to be taking questions. So we're going to have a little conversation in front of you here for about 5 minutes, 7, 10 minutes, I suppose. And then we're going to start engaging your questions. But both of us have been educators. Both of us have thought this would be really helpful to have. So what is it that's helpful about what we're trying to do, Nate? If you were to describe Humanitas to an educator who asks, well, what is it? How is it different from some of the other things that are out there?
Well, yeah, it's different from everything that's out there in a couple ways. First, it teaches history through primary texts. So traditional textbooks are 95% information,
Mm,
and it attempts to reduce things. So it's actually giving you an interpretation. And the best textbooks give you an unbiased interpretation, uh, which is
mm,
to say it's as least human as possible, right?
mm,
Uh, to be human is to have biases, and we ought to do well to like recognize those and recognize when they dispose us rightly, and they can
mm,
also dispose us poorly. But
mm, mm,
yeah, I think that the goal of a traditional textbook is to give you already sort of like pre-digested bits of information for the sake of a test. So it's something that you can then regurgitate and demonstrate mastery over because you can
mhm,
repeat information. So that's, to my mind, one of the big problems with something like an AP curriculum. Um, when I was teaching American letters, American literature and history, I actually read with my students the Mayflower Compact. And then we
mm,
moved to the Stamp Act and the Sugar Act, and we read the Proclamation of 1763. We read the Declaration of Independence, and we spent probably 3 weeks reading through the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, Federalist 1, 2, 10, 51, some of the
mhm, mhm,
documents. And the difference here is instead of being told what it means or why it's important, students actually get to walk through, as it were, from a distance. We enter in vicariously through the texts, right? You
mm,
actually get to walk through something of the actual experience. So
mhm,
approaching history through primary texts actually teaches you to think historically. That is to
mm,
say, it has the potential to give you a
mm,
historical in the way that you can learn to think mathematically, not by like regurgitating facts, but by studying Euclid, and you begin to go, oh, I can now think like a mathematician, as opposed to I can parrot a mathematical process that I don't properly understand.
mm,
So primary sources are what historians actually study. And most of them are written. Some of them are going to be artifacts, right? Whether architecture or paintings or these different things, graffiti, especially if we're talking about ancient Rome. But you
mm,
you begin to inhabit a different kind of mindset. You begin to see the world as the Greeks see it, and that
mhm,
is profoundly different, right? So, difference
mhm,
between reading about the Greeks at a distance, unbiased, as opposed to attempting to enter into and go, what if I breathe alongside the Greeks?
mm,
If I try to be inspired by those things that inspired them, what if I try
mhm,
to see through their eyes? Um,
mhm,
so whereas a textbook holds you at a distance, the primary text, it is an experience in and of itself. It's still mediated. The text is the mediator, the translator, the author is the mediator.
mhm,
But it gives you access to something that a textbook doesn't.
mm.
So I might have wandered away from your
No,
actual.
it's fascinating. I think you're doing a great job describing the value of going to the primary sources. Um, you reminded me of what Lewis says about this in his introduction to that to Athanasius's on the Incarnation. His essay that's been published independently called "On the Reading of Old Books."
Sure.
Um, could you describe what he says there? I mean, it's Lewis just makes such a great case for going to the primary sources. If I recall, he says something about uh, Plato. Like, well, because so let me just tee it up here for you. Plato is hard, Nate. Why would you want to read Plato? He's so difficult. You need somebody to, to 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 kind of help you understand him. So you don't really want to read these great authors in the, you need somebody to help mediate, the mediator.
Yeah, that's fun. Um, well, I think there's maybe two different ways to respond. One is to just directly answer your question in light of Lewis's argument.
Mhm.
So there's this little book written by Athanasius called On the Incarnation of the Word of God. And I read it for the first time in grad school when I was writing on theological aesthetics, poetics. Um, and the preface is written by Lewis, and it is an apology. It's a defense of old books.
Mhm.
And one of the things he says is we ought to read old books precisely because they differ from the modern outlook. So even like it doesn't matter, Republicans and Democrats,
Mhm.
Protestants or Orthodox or Catholics,
Mhm.
anybody who's living and thinking in the last 30, 40, 50 years thinks about the world very similarly. Uh, Now, there are profound differences in how we approach all these different things. And I laid out a
Mhm.
few categories where it should be easy to think about how we view the world differently.
Mhm.
But let me try to take a step back and explain. It's we all inhabit effectively a Newtonian framework. We all
Mhm.
inhabit in America that we take for granted,
Mhm.
that you have human rights and that you have rights as a United States citizen. Well, you step back into an old book and you go, the things that I think are natural and normal and common. This is how everybody thinks. Even people who I disagree with theologically on the political spectrum, people that
Mhm.
could be my exact opposite, we still have a remarkably similar way of viewing the world. And all of a sudden, you step back and you're in the 17th century or the 14th century, if we're thinking about Dante, and you go, oh, what I take for granted, he does not. And actually, that makes me think about whether or not my own beliefs are earned or if they're just sort of things that I acquired because they were floating in the air. So old
Mhm.
books are really valuable because precisely because they present a different view of reality than we have. And that helps my own awareness of how I view things come into focus.
Mhm.
Old books
Mhm.
then have a way of making you conscious of who you are and what you think and why you think so. Um,
Mhm.
as for Plato, yeah, Lewis, it's a really lovely line, actually. Now
Mhm.
that I think of it, he says there are a lot of students who, out of humility, won't go and pick up Plato off the shelf. They've heard that he is a great man and that the book is a great book. And so I need someone to help mediate that. I need to get a book on Plato that will. And he says, but if they would only pick up and read, tole lego,
Mhm.
right? Uh,
Mhm.
that's what Augustine
Mhm.
hears when he picks up scripture and begins reading. If they would only pick up and read the great man, they would see that because of his greatness, he's actually better to explain himself than all the people that have written about Plato. So
Mhm.
there's something about going to the source, and you think this through and you go, does a 20th century scholar understand Plato better than Plato did?
Mhm.
Uh, in my own teaching experience, my last teaching position, I was teaching Plato to seniors, and just some of the dialogues, the five dialogues published by Hackett, I think it is. And so we were reading through the Meno, and I thought, okay, I have to give them some context. I have to tell them who Plato was and what he thought and why this matters.
Mhm.
So I told the story about Socrates um, and his daimon, right? He has this spirit that attends him and it speaks to him, but it only speaks in the negative. So it doesn't tell him what to do, but it will sometimes tell him what not to do. And purportedly, he sets out to have these conversations throughout the ancient city of Athens to prove that he is not the wisest man in Athens. He goes, I know that I do not know. Uh, but there was this prophecy that he was the wisest man. So
Mhm.
I begin telling students this, and then we get to the next dialogue, and Socrates tells the story himself. And I went, if I would have only let Plato introduce Socrates, the students would have had a better introduction. It would have, right, like they would have got it firsthand. I think I've come to see my role as a teacher as being someone who tries to get students excited about what we're doing. This is a collaborative effort. to lead them to the text, to get them to see whatever question is animating the text. What is the nature of justice? We think we know something about piety, but it's really hard when you try to define it.
Mhm.
And then they get hooked, and your job is almost to disappear. It's to get out of the way. Because I don't want students thinking, wow, Mr. Antiel really knows Plato. I want them thinking Plato is fascinating. So if you can get the student hooked on the old book, go back to Lewis's term, the great man, then your job is to get out of the way. And it's at that point, it's collaborative, it's a shared venture.
Mm.
Uh, I won't pretend to understand Plato. Um, he's greater than I am. I enjoy reading him. I enjoy wrestling with him. It's a defeat that I suffer, but I think it's a magnificent defeat. And some of
Mhm.
his grandeur and some of his thought, some of his language and ideas rubs off in the process.
Yeah, you're so well said. And by the way, those of you who are listening, you see how this goes. Two educators just start talking. I hope you're enjoying this conversation, because this is what we're after, and we want this to happen with our students. But Nate, I'm going to go a little bit farther with Nate, and then we're going to get to the practical stuff, like how is the book laid out? Why did we, we're going to show you some images and that kind of thing. So if you're wondering if that's going to happen, it will. And we're going to take your questions. But I want to go just one step further with Nate and ask him another question. Is Plato himself more accessible than the commentators on Plato? If so, why?
He is. Uh, why? I, I mean, the cheap answer is because I've read the commentators and I've read Plato. It's so like personal experience. Why? I think the commentators have technical concerns that I'm not sure Plato did. But that's kind of that's a dry kind of academic answer. Some of it, I think, reflects the nature of the profession of philosophy. Right? There's a beautiful line in Thoreau. It's in Walden, maybe in, well, it doesn't matter what chapter, but he says we have too few philosophers and too many professors of philosophy,
Mhm.
which is to say, people that teach it but don't necessarily, right? Philosophy, philosophia, the love of, the pursuit of, right? The movement toward wisdom. We have too few of those and too many people that teach it.
Mhm.
So when you hold yourself at a distance and you go, what does the profession of philosophy look like? Well, in most academic situations, unfortunately, that looks like I have to publish a certain number of things for a tenure track position. It means I have to enter into what the current academic discourse centers
Mhm.
around, right?
Mhm.
And a lot of those things are not great. A lot of those things are small items,
Yeah.
right? The
Mhm.
texts, the texts themselves. So this is where you're actually at an advantage as an amateur, right? Etymologically, as a lover, you're at an
Mhm.
advantage when you're reading a great text for the first time because you don't have to be concerned with all the little things that ultimately don't matter, right? Um, so I think that's some of it. Um, I guess the other thing is Plato himself. I could just go back to Lewis. I mean, he says he's just going to be a better writer. I
Yeah.
mean,
That's why
I've
he's great. I mean,
yeah,
your comment about the greatness of Plato does not mean that he is arcane in his sophistication. Uh, Sometimes his greatness, and often his greatness, is his simplicity of insight.
right,
So, and that's just something that sometimes students don't presume, that, the greatness of the man might scare you off, but the greatness of Plato as a philosopher with a capital P means that he's addressing human things in ways that humans can apprehend. And that's why has been read for 2,500 years, and the commentators come and go. And it's not that we want to disabuse commentators. There's a place for them, but we're high school students, and even in college, you need to know the man himself. And so I just appreciate what you're pointing out, that greatness does not mean that it's inaccessibility.
Mm.
So let's okay, we've had a little bit of just giving you some kind of academic background and a little bit of philosophizing here about why we're doing what we're doing, but this is really important. Philosophy does guide our practice here. And we've been working now for several years, maybe 4 or 5, building out this series of a collection of primary source readings over a 4-year period of study. We started with America, and so we finished 4 volumes of collected readings, about 25 collected primary source readings per volume. It looks like this. I should turn off my blur feature. Why am I in perfect focus, but not the book? So the books have each about 25 readings, primary source readings, and they proceed chronologically. And we did America first because Chris Mayoka, our series editor, had already done a good bit of work in America. And then Chris and Nate turned their attention to building out Greece and Rome. So now we have published the Greece volume, which is 2 volumes actually, 50 primary source readings in Greek literature, philosophy, and history, and then 50 primary source readings in Roman history, philosophy, and literature. So Greece and Rome in 1 year, 50 primary source readings for both Greece and Rome. And now you're working on the medieval volumes. So we're going to be producing 2 volumes, early medieval and late medieval, and then we'll finally finish up with modern history. Nate, now we call this humane letters because while we do kind of privilege history, we also say it's humanitas, meaning that it's history. And could you describe that? Like, why would we also characterize this as a humane letters curriculum?
Well, for a number of reasons. One, we're trying to be true to the periods that are under study, and the separation of academic disciplines into these silos. So you get literature, you get history, you get philosophy. That's something that is a modern invention, right? Something that if you didn't read old books, you might not know. But you mentioned some of the Christian humanists, and you go, yeah, here's a good example. Here's somebody who has like Martin Luther or Erasmus, for instance. You might, what do you think of Martin Luther? He's a theologian. Well, he's not actually. He's a Old Testament languages professor at a small little institution, made made famous by himself and I suppose by Hamlet. But the well-educated human has all of these things. They happen organically in time, right? So to know something of literature actually is to know something of history. The distinctions aren't as valid, and they're certainly not as strong. So you look at Homer and you go, does he teach us something about Greek history? And I think the answer is yes. Does he give us something about the pre-Socratic, like philosophical mind? And you go, yeah, I think the answer is yes. He's obviously a poet. He's an artist. He's all of these things. He's human. So part of the reason that we call it Humanitas is because we're studying that which is human, the humane, that which makes you humane. So you think about the liberal arts, the trivium, the quadrivium, you think about the fine arts, and you go, these are things that the humanists, right? They were capable, they were dexterous in all of these things. And a lot of the distinctions that we have today, when you go back and you look at and you begin reading some of the primary sources, you go, well, those are spurious distinctions. They're actually they're not proper. The Greeks themselves wouldn't have recognized that as a valid disciplinary distinction. But I think
within history, there's multiple genres.
Yeah.
And so if you wouldn't mind like describing, since you were most recently working on Greece, like what kind of genre are represented in our volume on Greek, the Greek Humanitas volume?
Sure. And I think I saw a comment. I closed my chat, but I think I saw that Rick Trembo was attending. So he was our primary author for this book. So Rick, feel free to chime in at any point if you. What genres? Epic. So we get Homer and Hesiod. Um, Lyric poetry. So we have
Mm,
sections by Sappho. In the Rome volumes, we have sections by all the Golden Age poets of Rome. Um, Tragedy, comedy. So we get the three tragedians: Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, uh, Aristophanes. And we have what we would call historical documents, political documents. So the
mm,
Constitution of Athens, a text by an author that we call the Old Oligarch. Um, we've got, let's see,
mm,
Xenophon. So we have their, I mean, they're great. Philosophical dialogues. We have his record of the March of the 10,000. So they go deep into Persia, lose their leaders, and find themselves completely behind enemy lines. And they have 10,000, and they have to march all the way back to the sea. So it's his account of that. Um, we have well, I guess the short answer is any genre that you can think of that comes from these periods is somehow present in the book. I've covered the big ones. We get to some philosophy proper. So we have excerpts from Plato and Aristotle, rhetoric. We have Isocrates in the table of contents for Greece. And we also get into things that relate to uh, science. So we've got the atomists, the early Greek scientists. We've got
mm.
um, Hippocrates and the school of Hippocrates that follows from him. Um, we also have biographies of great men. So there's some
Yeah,
Plutarch. There's some Plutarch in there as well.
yeah. Thank you. So those of you listening, you can hear and see that it is multiple genre, and therefore, when we use the word history, we're thinking of it in this broader sense of the concerns of the human. And some of you know that Latin word humanitas was also a word used for education. It was frequently used as well as educatio to just describe what it would mean if you could get a good education. You would have humanitas. The things that concern the human would be the things that you would study. So we call this, as you can see in the title, the essential readings for the study of history. But we are thinking of history in this kind of more multiple genre global sense that Nate's been describing. And we thought, we should at least show you a few things and get Nate to give you some commentary and start taking some questions. So I've selected this Greece volume, the first volume of Greece. Now we have two, so this would be about 25 readings. And there you can see Rick Trumbo is on the call, and he is one of the contributing authors here. So it's just great to have you here, Rick. I also saw that Robert Woods is on the call. Robert, thank you for joining. He's at Faulkner University. He leads a PhD program there and has written a number of great books. So you can see the table of contents, and how we've tried to create some categories: the land of the gods, and leading off with Hesiod and the Theogony, and then you can read there the various myths from the Greek world that are important for anybody who's educated to know about. The archaic era, the individual and community, barbarians and Greeks, etc. So enough of the contents. Let me show you a sample chapter here. I'm going through a timeline. Here's an introduction to the birth of the gods as we introduce that section on Greek myths and theogony. And then we will get to, well, this very famous work by Hesiod called the Theogony, the birth of the gods, how they all come about. And he writes a mythic story about how they all came about. It's kind of the beginning of the beginning for Greek mythology. And Nate, I'm just going to scroll here while you make some commentary. But first, if you wouldn't mind, just talk about the layout. Like why is the book laid out in this particular visual way?
Uh, Because it's beautiful, and beauty doesn't need a justification.
Mm,
Uh, that's the short answer.
mm.
That's not what you were asking, I suppose.
I like the answer though.
Yeah, fair enough. Why is it laid out this way? So here we have the text proper, um, and there are marginal glosses on the in the right-hand margin. So the first time you see the word muse, students who are what, ninth grade, the curriculum is really flexible. So, I've seen schools that begin with ancient history in ninth grade, and I've seen some that reserve it for 11th or 12th grade because they want to do, there's obvious things you could do with Plato with a senior in high school that you couldn't do with a freshman in high school. So it's meant to be flexible. But first time the student comes across the word muse, so there's a little gloss there. These are the 9 goddesses. They're the daughters of Zeus, and then you get the Greek name there uh,
Mhm.
in the translation, memory, and I just can't. It's not.
Mnemosyne.
Yeah,
Very
couldn't read
difficult
it.
to say.
Couldn't read it with the font. So you get marginal glosses that just kind of help students where, and this is where I suppose my classroom experience is helpful. Reading through the text, you go, here are the kinds of things that students will have questions about. So you could read this aloud with students in class. You can assign it for homework overnight, and they read it, and then you come together and you talk about it. But one of the other things we're trying to do here is to bring students not only into the historical period that is under study, but also into the great conversation. And that
Mm,
kind of happens in 2 ways. One, Hesiod is first, and he's someone that we'll come back to time and again as the volume continues. Other authors will talk about Hesiod and Homer. Other authors will talk about the mythic view. And so, as students read through the volume, they'll see that Hesiod appears in the thought of Plato. He appears in, right. The other way that he appears is in art. So
mhm,
part of the great conversation is to recognize, uh,
mhm,
well, how has Hesiod been interpreted by other poets and artists? So here's a rendering of that's Hesiod himself, and that's one of the muses. And you can see Mount Helicon in the background there, and it looks like there's a Greek um, temple on the top. So
mm,
it's meant to complement the text. And the visual art, this is what's really fun for me. 'Cause my wife's a painter, she's an artist, and I have a
mm,
background in art and aesthetics. But you look at this and you go, on the one hand, it has the potential to offer commentary or interpretation. On the other hand, sometimes it seems to illustrate the text. But the art gives you a visual representation through that artist's eyes of what's happening. So there we have the Garden of the Hesperides, um,
mhm,
and we see the women dancing, and you go, "That's interesting." Uh, what about the poetry is like a dance? What about the poetry? So I think it's really great. It pulls you into
mm,
uh, the world of Hesiod.
mm,
So it gives you that visual draw. These we call history highlights. They are sort of our gesture toward, I suppose, the kinds of things that you would find more in a traditional textbook. So this is where we just teach didactically, right? So what is a bard? So there's an
mhm,
explanation of the age of bards and the difference between oral poetry and written poetry.
mhm,
Haven't looked at that in forever, but it might call on Lewis's distinction between primary and secondary epic. If not here, it happens later.
mhm,
So we have these little highlights that try to situate the author of this chapter historically. Hesiod is a shepherd. He's also a poet. He lives in the age of the bards. What does that look like? Greek is coming out of a sort of dark Greece rather is coming out of a sort of dark age where
mhm,
literacy was all but lost. Oral
mm,
poetry remained, but right. So then students, as they're reading through, they go, "Wait, so there wasn't like a text? Somebody had this memorized and would chant it? What is that? What does that sound like?" Well,
mm.
if you buy our teachers that we're working on. The first one is just at proof right now. So the first 25 chapters of Greece are done. We just need to get the PDF proofed and get it up. But there are different exercises that help guide teachers through, like, how do you chant poetry so that students hear it and experience it for themselves. It's nice to look at some of this art as I go by, but what if I want to actually do like a picture study, whether that's a Mason picture study or learning to sit and look and sitting in silence for a few minutes before a great work of art. And then there's a series of questions that help teachers kind of like walk through this process of learning how to read a painting, learning how to read a sculpture. So those are some of the things that I see as we're just kind of scrolling through here.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for mentioning the teacher's edition. And before we break, I'll pull that up too, so you can see some of the prompts and questions that we create for the teacher's edition, including, prompts for, I think you mentioned that, but how to lead a seminar or discussion on some of these texts. So we're trying to teach the teacher as we go. We're presuming that not every teacher who will use this book has had training in leading literature or textual discussions. So we try to provide some prompts and help. And then here you're seeing more of the text. So the text is in that parchment color all the way through. But yeah, the way we've described this is to say sometimes part of what we're doing here is, well, art history. It's part art history. And Nate, maybe you could just describe for the viewers how much work you and others have put into selecting the art, because we didn't just go on the internet and find clip some things off of a Google search. Could you talk about that?
Yeah, it was. I don't want to admit how much time. It's been for me, it's been a labor of love, but it's certainly a labor. So we've hired different art directors. I serve as an amateur art director, but we've got PhDs in art history. We had a Oxford classicist. We have general curator of, he's actually just recently moved to museums, but people who have made their careers in art history. So pulling these things together, you'll see as we're scrolling through, we were looking at some amphora earlier. These are paintings, but I suppose the way I explain it is that we have art from the period. And so here you're looking at amphorae that are, I don't know if the date is given in that caption or not. Looks like it might not. Well, archaic era. Right. So that's not contemporary with Hesiod, but it's actually within a couple hundred years of when we think Hesiod lived. So art from the period, and there's times then in the Rome book, for instance, where we read Vitruvius on architecture, and then we have beautiful photographs and sometimes paintings of the architecture that he's talking about and that he built. So art from the period and then art about the period. And that's where some of these Renaissance, post-Renaissance paintings, right? So we've, across, it is, it is art history in a way that makes you fall in love with art, right? I mean, like when art history is done well, it's magnificent. When it's memorize the name, the date, the medium, so that you can regurgitate it, I see how that can become dry. But yeah, it's from the period, it's about the period. And we walk you through the captions, through various different exercises about how to interpret what you're seeing. Students will pick the iconography as they go. So they'll slowly learn through the captions, like the way that your eye should be drawn to the upper right, the way that the bodies are postured, right? The colors. So we will see gestures towards Mary when we see an important Roman figure with very pale skin and she's clothed in Mary's blue. And you go, oh, this actually comes from, the Counter-Reformation. And so there's different interpretive elements going on. So students will learn how to read and think through and also just enjoy the artwork.
Yeah.
I think that's a big thing.
I'm reminded that Sarah says in her article on the Lost Tools of Learning that students should be exposed when they're studying history to the art and architecture of the period to to pique their imagination, to
Sure.
begin to kind of imagine what it's like to live, what it was like to live in those periods. So yeah, that a lot of work went into this is part art history. Is just another way of underlining that once again. And then what about this, Nate? What this is a section that appears in every chapter. What is
Right.
its purpose?
Yep, those are the history highlights. So I touched on those briefly. They're essentially of two species. One relates to the author of the text or the primary subject of the text. So this is where I think I said we're a little bit more didactic. So in the chapter on Alexander the Great, for instance, we have other things about the life of Alexander that fall outside of the primary text, right? So we know much about him, even though Plutarch's, the excerpt that we have from Plutarch on Alexander doesn't tell us everything about him. So that's where we flesh out some of those things. The other species of history highlight is about important contemporary, roughly contemporary events. So when Hesiod is writing, Rome is being built, right? So this, the top one there, not built in a day, is drawing the connection. So it allows students to become aware of what's happening in the broader world. So a lot of that is Western, sometimes it's Eastern. So we'll talk about the construction of the Great Wall of China, talk about different figures like Confucius, and put them in conversation with the historical period and the author and the text that we're studying.
Thank
When
you.
we get to yeah.
And then just some more history, and then I noticed we end with an afterword, and then questions for discussion and writing.
Right.
Yeah. Why?
Well, because trying to remember who said this. It might have been Petrarch. I can't remember. We read in order to discuss, and we discuss in order to write, and we write in order to better clarify our thought. Because the first thing that's going to happen when you read Homer is you're going to want to talk to somebody about it. So we've crafted really in-depth and elegant and lovely discussion questions. This is one of the things that infuriates me about traditional textbooks. You get to the end and there's review questions, and they're always disappointing. These are really excellent. Called on a former colleague of mine to craft these for Greece. So they're written by folks that have basically a minimum of 10 years experience in classical education classrooms. They're very much informed by classical pedagogy. And one of the effects that they have is that they will teach you how to think about, how to question, how to read primary sources. So it's an education in itself. If you just read this book and looked at the questions and thought through, like, what kind of questions do they ask? These are all questions that can be used for a 30 to 90-minute Socratic seminar. They're also the kind of questions that you could use for shorter. So we don't expect you to spend 9 days on this chapter. You could spend one day on each of those 9 questions, right? So they're the kind of things that they're also there for teachers. So any teacher reading through, they might go, whoa, that's fascinating. Prometheus, I want to talk about that. And they might not be interested in what Zeus is doing in the chapter. Fine. So there's a question about Prometheus. These questions will make cross references to different authors and chapters. So as we get to Aeschylus on Prometheus, one of the questions asks you to think through whether or not he's advancing the vision of Prometheus that we found in Hesiod, whether he's critiquing that. Are there different Prometheuses that emerge, things like that. And they're also the kind of things that you can use in assessment. So they can function as take-home and or in-class essay prompts. And they're the kind of things that I don't think you can exhaust some of the questions, right? probably over half of them are the kind of things that even if you discussed it in class, you could still give it to students as an essay prompt
Yes.
and ask them to go like, don't repeat what we did, go beyond, take it
Yeah.
in a direction. So they're great. They're subjects, the texts themselves are subject to endless contemplation.
Mm-hmm.
And I think
Thank
that the
you, Nate.
questions help point that out.
Yeah, I really appreciate uh, you drawing attention to the time and effort that went into getting great questions crafted. Well, it's time now for us to go to some Q&A to make sure that we answer some of the practical questions that you have. And so I'm just going to go through them, and Nate and I will do our best to give you good answers. Um, Robert Woods just says thank you. He's thrilled about this. One attendee says, do you read the primary text out loud as a class, or should they read the text on their own and then discuss? What in general do you recommend reading as a class versus student reading on their own? Uh, I would say that it can vary. It's certainly doing some reading outside of class is great, but occasional reading inside of in the class is great. Um, Ratios, I think, vary too, depending on the time you've got, the classes, the students, and so forth. But Nate, don't you think that some out loud reading is important to get close to the text and kind of intone it? I'm sure you do that when you teach.
Absolutely. I think it depends. I would suppose just repeat what you said, both. Some of it depends on the students that you have. Some of it depends on the text. So there's going to be some texts that are more suited to reading out loud. There's also going to be times where you should have students read the entire thing, come to class, and then you read a portion out loud and discuss that portion. So, pedagogically, I think there's a number of different ways to go about it. When you we often forget that you're not only teaching Hesiod and Homer, you're not only teaching Aeschylus, you're also teaching things like how to have a conversation, how to politely and charitably disagree with your peers and your classmates. We're teaching a lot more than just content. This goes back to your point about Humanitas. We're hopefully teaching how to be human. So a lot of that also means we're not just teaching Homer, we're teaching students how to read Homer. And one of the ways you do that is by reading Homer aloud with and for students.
Yeah.
So it depends on how much time you want to spend on it. Depends on, I guess what I'm saying is the curriculum is really flexible. And I think it's a great question. It's hard to answer in the abstract.
Yeah,
if I were
absolutely.
doing this with freshmen, I would read a lot out loud in the beginning and then less out loud so that the onus shifts from class to the student. If I were reading this with older students, I would probably have them read most of it on their own and spend class time more on discussion.
Thank you. A couple of practical questions have come up, like when will ancient Greece and Rome be available? And I think Greece is just about back from the printer, if not already. And then Rome has been sent off. So it's going to be ready for this next academic year. Both of those books are kind of under wraps. And Nate is hard at work with a team, especially with one of our primary contributing authors, Junius Johnson, working on the medieval volumes, early and late medieval. And about this time next year, those medieval volumes should be available. And then Catherine Tully asks, where to begin? Number one, how would you advise a ninth grader to start? Number two, what if you have a high school senior who would like to dip back through some of this but does not have background in the classical model? How would you advise a ninth grader to start? Well, I'll go quickly and hear what you say, Nate. I think history can be studied chronologically or not, right? It's not critically important that, you don't do American history until you've done, Greece and Rome and medieval history. But I do my personal preferences if I can. I do like to introduce things chronologically, but don't let that stop you. For example, if you have a 12th grader who's never studied Greece and Rome and you think that would really be important, might be great to have your 12th grader study Greece and Rome. But if you have a ninth grader, you have an opportunity to kind of move through a sequence of learning chronologically. And so if I could, I would, let's see how Nate answers the question, but I would start with Greece and Rome, then go to the medieval period, then go to the American history, and then do modern. So that you can see a kind of a sequence of development over human history. What say you, Nate?
Yeah, I think that's right. Um, I cut my teeth teaching at the Trinity schools. So
Mhm.
they're some of the oldest classical schools in the country, uh, along with, is it
A few
Lagos?
others, Care Paravel Latin
Yeah.
School.
So at Trinity, what we did was we actually started ninth grade with American, and the ratio behind that decision was it's most familiar. So the
Mhm.
students were youngest, American is most familiar. I
Yeah.
think part of the ratio also was we wanted to be able to do, so students read the whole of the Republic and the whole of Aristotle's Ethics. We can't do that with ninth grade. So they bumped that up. But I think I had a I had a professor in undergrad when I went to him and said, I, I had a year abroad over in England and I came back and went, okay, I've been ruined. Like I want to pursue the academic life in some way, but I feel like I'm just behind. Like where do I begin? And he said, just begin. It really doesn't matter. You're going to swim upstream or you're going to swim downstream. So if you start with Luther, you'll read enough and then, you get to Melanchthon and you'll read Melanchthon's oration on Homer and you'll go, I've never read Homer. And then you go back. So you swim in upstream or you read downstream. Um, we've, in terms of how these books are laid out, I think they're flexible enough so that you could use the Greece and Rome books for ninth grade or for 12th grade. But we're approaching them in regards to pedagogy, the kinds of questions, some of the rigor and the difficulty of texts. I think it wouldn't be a bad idea to start freshman year with Greece and Rome, and senior year then would be the early modern period.
Yeah. Well, Nate, now we have to go a little faster. Thank you, though. These uh, start either direction, go upstream or downstream, depending on your circumstances. But here are a couple more. Would this replace the literature, writing, history curriculum? Meaning, does it combine literature, writing, and history into one, or will you still need to supplement? Well, that's a great question from Leanne Lee. It does, I think, replace. It can replace history and literature, but we think that you still are going to want to supplement what this might not be the only thing you do in high school grades. For example, you want to read some whole books. We have lots of great excerpts that give you a really good feel for human development and intellectual thought and art and so forth. For example, in the American books, we have an excerpt from Ben Franklin's autobiography, but you might want to read the entire autobiography. So I think, as you're planning your year, looking at what we've created, what we've curated for you, you might want to choose 4 or 5 or 6 books that you would read in their entirety. And if you're doing this to replace both literature and history in a traditional kind of school schedule, you have even more time because this is really would be 2 classes in one. So you might think of a 90-minute block, 4 to 5 days a week. So then you would want to choose some additional literature books, poetry, literature, etc., to read in their entirety. So we think this can be a kind of helpful spine for a history and literature humane letters course, but that you should be choosing whole books to read too. You want that rhythm of seeing the kind of landscape that we give you through these books, but also digging some deep wells and reading deeply in some great books. Then Chanel says, is this suitable for a once a week co-op meeting? If so, how much reading would be required each week? And Chanel, you'll want to look at these books, look at the samples, look at how many readings there are. I think the answer is yes, you could do it in once a week, but then that just means that the parent at home, the parent educator, will be having discussions with the student on those days when they're not meeting. And the student, of course, will need to be a good independent reader and be looking at those discussion and writing prompts that we have at the end of each chapter, and and writing out answers and preparing for discussions. So yes, it could be used flexibly that way. And then Kevin asks, are any of these Humanitas texts suitable for 6th, 7th, or 8th grade classes? And I think if you had a really advanced 8th grader, you might be able to slip this in, but we'd recommend really not doing this probably. You know, it will vary depending on the students. You might be able to use some of the readings, but not all of the readings, because we are presupposing a high school level student, and the quality and the level of writing that Nate and his team have crafted is going to be presupposing a high school student. We do have the Curious Historian line, which is more suitable for those grades. An anonymous attendee says, would this curriculum fit the frame of a middle school student, 7th and 8th grade? I kind of answered that question. Probably not, unless you adapted it because of the level at which it's written, unless you have really strong 7th and 8th grade students. And then Jenny Hankins asks, would this curriculum qualify for 1 credit in history and 1 credit in literature? Yes, it would, if you taught it as kind of a 2-class block. If you thought of this as history and literature, yes. But as we've already said, you'll need to include some additional readings. You'll need to read literature, whole books. Nate, any comments from you about that?
Well, yeah, I think it sounds like some of these questions are all kind of circling around similar things. I suppose I should just say lay out a couple details just to make sure everybody understands what the curriculum involves. So Greece and Rome is meant to be a year's worth of curriculum. So the freshman year, Greece would be first semester, Rome would be second. You could go in the other order, but we recommend Greece to Rome. And there are 100 total chapters, 100 total primary sources, 50 from Greece, 50 from Rome. You don't have to teach all 100, right? So if your school is going to do a separate history class and a literature class, we've tried to set it up so that they can work in concert. So I would recommend that you read one of Homer's books completely for the literature class. So if you do that, you probably don't need to read our Homer chapter. If you decide for your English classes that you really are going to focus on tragedy, so we're going to read through the Oresteia, we're going to read 3 different tragedies, right? Well, then reading the Homer chapter would be great, because they should know something of Homer in order to better understand Aeschylus. So the curriculum is meant to be flexible in that regard. And I think there's a couple different kinds of setups that are really common in schools, and that is to have English and history classes that are separate but correspond to similar periods. So I'll study modern history when I'm doing British literature. I'll study American history when I'm doing American literature, things like that. The Trinity schools, the Great Hearts schools, are modeled on Trinity, so they do this too. They actually have humane letters courses where they're all, I said something along these lines before, history and literature are taught by the same teacher, the same class, and that's where it is a one-to-one. So you get 1 credit for both, and we would move back and forth. So we would read all of Huckleberry Finn after we read through an account of before we read through the Civil War section when I was teaching American history. So I think that hopefully that kind of clarifies how you can use the book, and also how to supplement it. Because when you say you would have to supplement with whole books, not for the history side of things, but for the literature side of things, I would recommend you could supplement with some whole books.
Yeah, that's a helpful distinction. A lot of good primary source historical readings,
right?
But like, yeah, you made the point, I think, fairly plainly. If you're going to teach this along with the literature class, you're going to need to read several books in their entirety, but you could easily complement what's in there. You could choose some of the authors that are already represented by excerpt and some additional ones.
Right.
So
Yeah.
there's some flexibility for you as a classroom teacher or homeschool teacher to choose those books. I think what we're going to do next year, maybe even in the next 6 months, is we're going to be recommending lists of books that we think do complement the series. Like, because people are beginning to ask this question: what literature books should we read? Well, okay, here would be some great ones you might choose from to create a literature class that complements, that's part of the Humane Letters curriculum using Humanitas. Well, a couple more, and then and we're coming towards the end, and I want to thank everybody ahead of time for your kind attention. But let's see, Jackie Williams, um, oh, what kind of assessments do you recommend? This is an anonymous attendee. What kind of assessments do you recommend for American history for a 10th grade class? Again, the texts themselves have some great prompts and assessments. The questions following each chapter are going to give you more assessment ideas than you'll know what to do with, really. So I think that's the answer there.
Yeah.
Would you add to that, Nate?
Yeah, just a little. I don't know if you've seen this yet. I've
Mm.
been producing this for so the American books are already there. Greece and Rome are available for purchase right now. Medieval will be next year. Early modern will be the year after. But the teacher guides for the Greece and Rome books, um, I've got a section in the teacher guide on assessment.
Great.
So we talk about essay writing, and we talk about one other thing that we suggest is grading class participation. And so there's notes on how you do that. And the other thing we recommend is oral assessment. So this is something I've had quite a bit of experience with in the last 4 or 5 years, but actually taking students one-on-one and doing an oral exam. So it's more like the Oxford tutorial. When we get into medieval, I have a section on how to do disputation with students. So there's a lot of different things that you can do. What's really nice about having these different sources all together in a single book too is that you can have assessments where students still have access to the text. So what you're not testing is the student's ability to remember small facts. What you are assessing is whether or not a student has the ability to trace the development of ideas. So you can ask a question and allow the students to have access to the books, and they're rewarded then if they've annotated well, if they've made cross references to, so for 10th grade American history, this amendment harkens back to the Federalist controversy where they were discussing this. So you have all the sources there before you. So I think a lot of the kinds of essays that you can ask really should be driven by primary texts, and different things that happen across text. What does Mortimer Adler call that? Syntopical reading, reading across texts. So those are the kinds of assessments for American history. There are some perhaps obvious content things that you can do. You can have students memorize, the opening paragraph of the Declaration or the prologue of the Constitution. You can have them memorize presidents. So there's still memory things that you can do that I think work really well. But generally, we try to move students away toward mere regurgitation and toward thinking through writing.
Thanks, Nate. And reminded me to just share the teacher's guide that we do have for these volumes. So there's more than just those discussion questions in the teacher's guide, pedagogical tips, and as Nate's pointed out, other assessment recommendations. That comes to you as a digital download as a teacher. And then just have a few more questions and we're done. Does this series have enough background information to also serve or to use as a history spine, or would a different book need to be used for that? And I think Nate answered that earlier, saying yes, it can be used as your history spine, the fundamental material that you use in a history curriculum. It's there and woven in with some other genres we've already mentioned. Then Kevin McCaffrey asks, which Platonic dialogues should a beginning student of philosophy start with? Well, a little bit of a tangent, but a great question. It could probably take us a lot of time. So I'm going to give Nate 30 seconds on this. What is your recommendation? Where would you start?
The ones in our book. Um, well, I don't know. Where would you start with? I guess I would say it depends on what age.
Yeah,
So, um,
and time, because you might want to start with some of the short dialogues like the Meno or the Euthyphro before you dive into the Republic, and you probably ought not to read the laws, while you're in high school.
well,
Um,
yeah, yeah. Even to be honest, reading the Republic while you're in high school, it's a great exercise, but it also yeah. Have you met insufferable college students? They're like, "Oh, we read that in high school," and you're like, "Right." So no need to reread it, Plato. Like you mastered it because you read it as a
uh,
17. It's. I think, which I guess is a roundabout way of saying there are a couple things I think you shouldn't do. Yeah, yeah, the laws probably not start with the Republic. Um, I think I mean, the ones that we have in our book are not bad places to start at all. Uh, and then also, if you're looking for like a cluster of things, I think the five dialogues that Hackett publishes is a really good way to go. Um, I- it's hard. So I used to teach a course on art and aesthetics, and we did different bits of Plato. So we read from the Ion. So some of it is like, what do you want to talk about? Do
yeah,
you want to talk
it's
beauty? Do
really,
you want
mhm.
to
Very good point. And Kevin encouraged you to do a little research on that online. You'll find some really probably good advice and also some bad advice. But I think with high school students, um, I would start them with a couple of short ones on a topic that you think would be germane and interesting to them. And I think there are 33 of them, so there's a lot. Um, but anyway, that's a question that deserves more time. But we'll go to the last question, and then we'll have to wrap up our webinar. Jackie asks, "Do the Roman Greece books cross-reference with Jewish history at all?" Nate.
um a little bit uh without knowing, Jackie, what you actually have in mind. It doesn't follow like Old Testament history in that regard, but for Rome in particular, one chapter comes from Josephus. We have an account of the siege of Jerusalem, the fall of the temple, as Judaism and Christianity play different roles in Roman history. There are individual chapters there. So we've got a whole unit in Rome on philosophy and religion. But um it's not going to move. No, it's not going to move you from like Abraham through the birth of Christ.
Mhm.
And I know there are a lot of schools that teach Jewish history alongside Greece and Rome. Um, we just we just have to make decisions about. I mean, you can only fit so much in 100 chapters a year, and so we're following Greece and Rome, and then the medieval period. It's a more of a Western reading, I suppose.
Thank you, Nate. So we still have 20 minutes. And so this is good because it gives you a chance to maybe get into the weeds a little bit. So if you have some specific questions about the curriculum itself, um, if you have those practical questions about pricing or the kinds of the nature of the text, um, you've asked a number of you've asked questions about timing. That'd be helpful. I think it would be interesting right now if in the chat box, it would just be helpful for Nate and I to see what you teach. And tell us a little bit about what you teach and why or maybe let me change the question. Why are you on this call? That can include the fact that you're a teacher of a particular subject, but you might be an administrator who's just looking at curriculum to maybe make some recommendations for your own teaching staff to look at. But if you wouldn't mind, just tell us, what brought you to the seminar. Put that in the chat, and then that'll give you also, some of you, the opportunity to post another question. So based on what you've heard, feel free to post a question. And while you're doing that, I'm just going to tee up another sample to show you, and then we'll be wrapping up at 2:30. Oh, there's Jackie, who's asked a few questions. She teaches medieval history at Amarillo, Texas. Great. Thank you for those of you just posting a little bit about what you teach. I thought I would just show you this, and feel free to just keep posting your questions or your comments in the chat box. But just wanted to make sure you've seen this page. It's the kind of products page for Humanitas. It will show you all of the books that we have kind of in the queue right now. But make sure you also click on this little Learn More button, because the Learn More button will open up for you a video that we've created, kind of a trailer, a book trailer, if you will, and then another seminar that Nate led, describing the Humanitas curriculum when we first were beginning to publicize it. That'll be helpful to you to just get the big picture, and maybe to send it around to other people who might be interested. And then I want to just underscore again, we do have teacher resources, and those are digital and downloadable to help you teach each of these books. I'll say one more thing about that I think is a practical question that many of you will have, if you don't have it already. How do you use this with students in a year's time? 4 books that you would order, one essentially per quarter is how we've imagined it, and they're paperback. So we've designed these, they're high quality paperback, so that you could and they're priced, we think, fairly reasonably. It's under $30, so that students could actually own these books and mark them up. That was one of the things we wanted to make available as a possibility. And some schools are using them as classroom copies, and then we'll replace them as they need be. But think about it from an economic perspective. We think it's about the equivalent in terms of dollars to buy these 4 volumes, say in American history, give them to your students, as opposed to having to purchase a lot of other books that you would have to give to students, particularly in history and some in literature. So that's our hope. And that's just something I wanted to clarify for you. Now, I'm just looking at the list again. A lot of you are history teachers, literature teachers. Yeah, humanities teachers, humane letters teachers. We hope this will be a really great fit for you. We've designed it with you in mind, and we'd love to send you, especially if you're a part of a school, we can afford to send you an evaluation copy. We can't just send them out to individual teachers, but we can send them out to a school. So if you're a part of a school or a co-op, then we can send it to you send you an evaluation copy. We also have some, look at the samples that you can download as well. That might be another way to just further familiarize yourself with the curriculum. I see another question that's come in. So I'm going to answer or reread these questions for Nate and I. This is Anna Lucia. Nice name, by the way. So glad for this. Very appreciated it. Very much appreciated it. There are some initial teaching on pre-concepts. or are there some initial teaching or pre-concepts, pre-reading books aloud or language to begin with this in the early years? It could be living stories like theater or home while they're beginning to read. So I think, Nate, are there some things that uh, a teacher might do or a homeschooling educator might do as kind of pre-reading to get ready for a curriculum like this?
Well, I'm wondering, living stories or theater at home sounds like it's less prep for teachers and more for the younger students.
That's true. Yeah.
So, wow, yes, there's goodness. I'm laughing because I can't think of, I have a just turned 10 year old boy, and we've been doing this kind of stuff for the last 5 or 6 years. And there's so much stuff, it's almost overwhelming. Things that you could do. Um, D'Aulaire's Greek myths.
Mhm.
Tell you what, there's a really lovely, this would be for slightly older, so maybe more like 7, 8, 9 year olds. Really lovely book by Hawthorne called Tanglewood Tales. Is that right?
Mhm.
You read that, Chris?
Yes,
Retelling
my kids.
retelling of Greek myths. Mary Pope Osborne has some really fun, accessible retellings of Homer for children. Cap is actually working on a children's Homer, right? I don't
Yeah,
know
we
what.
do have a audio recording of Patrick Collins' Children's Homer, and the book is great too. But yeah, I read that to my kids when they were young. It's remarkable, as well as his Jason and the Argonauts and the Golden Fleece by
Yeah,
Patrick Collins.
yeah. We read that 2 summers ago.
Uh,
There's another one that just came out that I can't remember the author's name. But I tell you what, another thing that's really wonderful to do is to go to your local museums. So if you have a state MFA, um, the North Carolina Museum of Art, the Virginia MFA is great, but a lot of them have a section that's devoted to classical art and architecture, and that's a really wonderful way to whet students' appetite for this kind of thing. And when you actually get to see something in person and you see how big it is and how much detail, and that's something that I think is really good and really important too. For if you did want 1 or 2 suggestions for initial teaching or pre-concepts in that regard, I might recommend Poetic Knowledge by James Taylor.
mhm.
His thesis is about direct encounters with the thing as opposed to mediated encounters where you are told about something. It's actually best to experience the thing itself. That's really wonderful. I don't mean to sound like I'm only plugging caps things. I just think that one of the better things out there at the moment is the liberal arts tradition by Ravi and Kevin. So that might
Mhm.
be another text that I would recommend if you're looking for some of the concepts about classical pedagogy, how to think through
Mhm.
curriculum across K-12. I think that's a really excellent book. So
Yeah.
those are 2
Yep.
suggestions.
Reminding me, and I'm seeing Alex Marcos on the call too. Reminds me that Louis Marcos happens to be Alex's dad. Is his book Myth Made Fact is also helpful to familiarize yourself with some Greece and Roman myths. And Bullfinch's Mythology, if you can get copies of that 3-volume work, beautifully illustrated myths, not only from Greece and Rome, but also the Norse myths. Okay, and then that leads me to Galen and Aidan Tierney ask, what kind of peer review does this series have? Yeah, who peer? That's a great question, and I'll let Nate answer it.
Well, we have a team of both teachers and then scholars that worked to produce the book, and a separate group that has done the peer review. So for 2 reasons. One, because we want to ensure the quality of the scholarship. Second, we want to make sure that the quality of the pedagogy is what we're looking for, that it's actually thoughtful classical pedagogy, that it corresponds to basically Cap's vision of what classical education can and even should be. So I played a small role in that regard, just because I've had some experience, well, 15 years experience
Mhm.
teaching classical education. Um, I'm about to teach a course in the Templeton Honors College, their Masters of Arts and Teaching program, actually. Uh, so some of my background academically is actually in pedagogy, so that's part of it. In terms of the scholars, we've drawn on scholars from Duke and Yale and Notre Dame. Um, there's a few other, I think it's either Penn State or Princeton, I can't remember. So we've had a team of different people uh, work through the entire thing with an eye towards both the content and the pedagogy. I don't know if
Yes.
that's what was asking.
Yeah, you're right. We've had to go recruit scholars, usually within our own network, and scholar to scholar, and some that we've known who already had expertise in an area. So we've done that, Galen, Aiden, at some time and expense, as you might imagine. Alex Marcos asked, "What would you say to a teacher who can only fit in less than half of the content of Greece and Rome, of like our series? Looking at the curriculum, I cannot imagine teaching more than 40 of the 100 chapters. Would this be a good investment or not?"
I'd say, come on, Alex, you can do more than 40. No, but you really could do more than 40. So I don't have it on me. The rough word count per chapter for the primary text is going to be around somewhere between like 4,500 and 5,500 words. So you what does that translate to? Maybe 15 or 20 pages worth of reading. So with that in mind, you could absolutely do more than 40 a year. Even if you spent it's kind of set up so that you would spend 1 day on each chapter. But even if you spent 2 days on each chapter, you think through how many days are in a academic school year. It's going to be somewhere around 180. Is that right, Chris?
Yeah, usually between 160 and 180.
Okay, so even if you spent 2 full days on a chapter, you could get through, you know, you could get through 90. Um, but remember, you're going to be negotiating with whoever's teaching history or whoever's teaching English. You're gonna craft your course based on what you're interested in, what your background is in, what students are able to do. So when I think about, yeah, there's 100 chapters. Tell you what, I've never been in any class in high school, certainly, or in college, where we read every page of the book that was assigned. So even as a history major in undergrad, it was like we would leave 80 to 120 pages of a 550 page book. Um, so we've presented you with 100 options, but I think if you taught 80 or 85, I would count that a great success. Part of the goal is not to finish, it's to do it well. And so there's different reasons for skipping chapters. If you're reading texts in your English class, that's one reason. If you just don't have time, that's another good reason. If you go, I want to focus on Athens, and that means I'm going to spend less time on something else that's happening, maybe the later philosophical movements. You go, well, they're going to get that senior year, so I want to focus more on Athens. So we'll cut those chapters on Epicureanism and.
Yeah.
So, yeah, would it be a good investment if you taught only 40 of 100? Well, that's up to you. I think you could absolutely do more than 40 in a school year.
It could be that in some cases, schools can use this in two classes simultaneously. A literature teacher, a history teacher, possibly a theology teacher could be using this across those classes in some kind of cooperative endeavor. But yes, I was underlying what you've said, Nate, that there's no requirement to read all 100, of course. And think of it as an anthology. If we haven't called it that per se, but it is an anthology. It's a gathering of primary source readings. And so hopefully it will be a good investment, even if you can't do all 100. But I know people are counting their dollars as well and so forth. But to have these available, I think would be tremendous asset for you if it makes economic sense as well. So hopefully it will in your case, Alex. We would be glad to send, I know you're at the Geneva School of Bernie, be glad to send you an evaluation copy to the school. And then Chanel Davis asks, I lead a co-op class and I've been teaching all of the subjects with classical conversations. We're now leaving classical conversations and we're looking for curriculum. My students are now in grade 9. I'm wondering how this compares to the Roman Roads curriculum. Oh, yeah, yeah, Wes Callahan does good work. This is set up with the Roman Roads curriculum, and you know, we're friends with Wes, by the way. We love him. But they're we're you know, the curricula set up a little bit differently, and you'll have to do a compare and contrast to see what really will fit for you. I think now you've got a good idea of what we do. As I recall, Wes does a lot of really interesting recording, like video recording of the Western tradition. And I'm sure there's some written resources and so forth as well, but I'm just not as familiar with that to be able to give you a good comparison. And then, of course, I would probably give you a biased one anyway, but I do really respect Wes Callahan. But now that you're in 9th grade, you're in a perfect place to start with Humanitas, since we have 2 years of curricula done. I think you're in a good place to start with Humanitas. And then Amy says this. She says, understanding that this resource is not designed for middle school grades, does Nate have any advice or resource recommendations for how to best teach younger students to engage in close reading of primary sources?
Oh, yes, too many to name. Um, Well, so the teacher guides for Greece and Rome do a lot of this. So we're trying to bring you into how to do this as you go through the text. So if you're interested in Humanitas, you will get some of that pedagogical side there. I think, well, the easy answer is you have to do it with the students, right? So I sometimes I would ask students to annotate as a regular practice. So then instead of reading quizzes, which don't actually quiz whether or not students read, sometimes they quiz whether or not students talk about reading quizzes between classes, right? um, Instead of offering reading quizzes, I would sometimes do annotation checks. And so I would gather the students' books so they'd open it and I'd come and look. And I would not grade it, but I would grade it. But I would talk about why the annotations were good or bad. So how to do a close reading. And we would do it together. So we'd take the first paragraph of the text and we would do a careful close reading. So a lot of it is attention to individual details, right? What kind of language is used? What does this word mean? Does it remind you of something? What immediately comes to mind is the opening paragraph of Walden. He says that he was a sojourner for 2 years and 2 months. No, he says he spent 2 years and 2 months in the woods, and at present he is a sojourner in civilized society. And you don't let students leave until somebody recognizes that, wait, but a sojourn means a short stay. How is it that that wasn't the sojourn, the 2 years? He's a sojourner when he goes back to the way that he's always lived. And you slowly begin to see the text, and the text unfolds before you. In terms of resources about how to do that, how to teach it. I can't point you towards particular webinars, but I know that Classical U has things on that. CAP also does some teaching consulting where we do that kind of thing. There's a great little essay from maybe 15, 20 years ago by Timothy Parks in the New York Review of Books called A Weapon for Readers. Reading with a pen in hand. Timothy Parks, A Weapon for Readers. That's a phenomenal little essay, and it explains the value of close reading, how to do it. And there's even some photographs of David Foster Wallace's copy of a book by C.S. Lewis, for instance. And he talks about how to do it, why it's valuable. And I'd also point you to a book by Mortimer Adler, The Paideia.
Proposal?
I think it's the Paideia Program. It's one he
Oh,
wrote
yeah.
3 Paideia books, but one of them has a chapter on um, how to run a seminar, how to coach, where it's more one-on-one back and forth. And then
Mhm.
actually Mortimer Adler's How to Read a Book. He has, I think, five different chapters that deal with close reading and annotating in particular. Chapters 2, 3, 5, 8, and 9 is what I used to teach that with students actually. So I would, they would have the book, and when that didn't happen, I would use the school's resources and print copies of 5 chapters of How to Read a Book.
Mm.
Um, but that's a really good way to begin doing it too. Um, you have to go slow. You
Mhm.
just have to be willing to slow down and spend time, with students. It's really valuable. So you might feel like you're wasting time because we got nothing done, but actually what you're doing is planting the seed so that the student has a better experience for the rest of the year. So it's something that you can do always, no matter what grade level. Slowing down and doing close readings are really, really helpful and really important.
Well, thank you, Nate, and thank you, Amy, for that question. And I did write down the name of that essay. That sounds really fascinating. I'll just add that James Sire has written a book similar. It's kind of like a digest of everything that Nate's talked about. It's a simpler book, but it's called How to Read a Book Slowly, and it has a similar kind of recommendations. Well, thank you everyone for your time, and most of all, thank you for the work that you're doing in your own schools and homeschools, trying to renew education in the United States. We're glad to be collaborating with you. Have a great afternoon or evening, or if you happen to be on the far side of the earth, a good morning. But it's been really a pleasure to be with you. Thank you. Thanks, Nate.
Yeah, my pleasure.